Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Ron from International Trade Council. Thank you for attending today's educational session. Before we start, I just want to do a quick housekeeping. From the audience side, if you can hear me, please type in yes on the chat box. And if you can also see the PowerPoint presentation, please feel free to type in yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. How about the others? All right, perfect. Thank you. So we're currently having a webinar about Innovate for Impact, Advancing Sustainability, Skills, and Diversity. So this webinar is for an hour, 45 minutes for presentation, and 15 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions, just please feel free to type in your questions here in the chat box or Q&A box, and our presenter will going to ask or answer the question after the presentation. So our speaker for today is Mr. Nish Acharya, CEO of Equal Innovation. And in this webinar, you will learn about current global innovation trends and areas of focus for R&D and innovation. Learn about current startup ecosystems that are most vibrant and up and coming beyond Silicon Valley. Understand the role of innovation in achieving major commitments like net zero, and understand how to engage startups and innovation into your organization. So let's now hear from our speaker. So go ahead, Mr. Akaria.
Great. Thank you very much, Ron, and good day to everybody, wherever you might be joining us from Asia, Europe, Middle East, Africa, North America, South America. Welcome. Want to talk to you a little bit today about the role of innovation in addressing major global challenges. And we live in a world where we talk a lot about innovation and artificial intelligence and technology, and we read about Silicon Valley, and that's all really important. But one of the things we found over the last few years is that we have some major global challenges to address, whether that's climate change or migration or a globally diversified workforce. And companies and governments are making major commitments in those areas to make a difference, both from a business bottom line perspective as well as from a corporate philanthropy perspective. And here, I want to talk to you a little bit today about the role that startups, entrepreneurs, and innovation means as we think about those major global challenges that we're facing. So if we think about, first we want to talk about the corporate commitments that were made and the new models that we're looking at. So 2020 was a really important year for the world in a lot of ways, right? The first was the pandemic happened, and I'll talk a little bit about the follow-up from the pandemic. But the pandemic obviously stopped all of us in our tracks, led to a lot of illness, of death. But one of the things that people realized through the pandemic process was the role, the importance of innovation. And when we certainly supported masks, public service announcements, we stayed home, we kept kids home from school, and that was supported by philanthropy. Companies developed solutions on the fly. But the game changer was the vaccines. And that's what's allowed us to all get back to our routine lives in most of the world. And so we've started thinking about innovation as more critical to solving not just business skills and developing new products, but addressing the broader challenges we face. And again, if you think about global corporations, they faced several challenges that really came together in 2020, but they continue to work on. The first was diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there's much more of an emphasis on having a diverse workforce in the world, representative not just of your employees, but also of your vendors, your suppliers, race, gender, geography. All of those things are important. And particularly when we look at it from the United States perspective, we have a shrinking workforce. And so leveraging the population as we currently have it is critical. So that means identifying people who are historically not included in your corporate workforce and thinking about ways that can engage them. And so what we've seen at Equal Innovation, and we do a lot of scouting of startup companies and innovations for large companies, government agencies, foundations, and others, is some of these things. That there's a lot of interest in digital skilling tools. And so we're all doing this virtually. How do we create a workforce that can use more digital tools? Supplier diversity tools. Companies often outsource 20% of their contract work to small businesses that are run by women or communities that are less represented. Are there portals? Are there tools to leverage to find those diverse vendors and suppliers? Remote work solutions. What's going to be the right balance of remote work, of online and offline? And of course, how do we use new technologies like AI to track our compliance in this and help with our planning? So diversity, equity, inclusion in the United States, it became a big deal with the murder of George Floyd. It has stayed at the forefront, certainly as people think both about the diversity of the workforce, but also the diversity about how we work and where we work. The second big area that didn't start certainly in 2020, but for whatever reason also became an important issue was climate change. And here it's very interesting because around the world, we've seen companies and companies make major commitments to fighting climate change. There's been billions of dollars committed to fighting climate change across the board. So this might be carbon capture, which is a means of eliminating carbon from the atmosphere. It might mean sustainable agriculture. It might mean biodiversity and the importance of not losing species, national parks and things of that nature. So it means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And as a result, we're seeing a little bit of everything in the climate space as well. So companies and governments are looking at footprint tracking technologies, a big part of what the work they're looking for. So if you're a major Fortune 500 company and you've committed to reducing your net zero, your footprint to net zero, you have to be able to track that. That includes your emissions, that includes your supply chain, that includes your work of your vendors, and the last mile of how your customers dispose perhaps of the materials. So that's whole tracking the value chain, the full end-to-end of the supply chain, very important. We're seeing a lot of green material investment. So cement, what's called level 5 cement, which uses less water, reduces emissions, all of that. Seeing that across the board. Plant-based foods has been a big area in this space where people are looking at other ways to address climate change in addition to reducing their footprint, but to innovate new products and services. Obviously, emerging technologies like carbon capture, geoengineering, the idea of these sort of big global solutions that will reduce the Earth's temperature or growth of its temperature rate. And of course, looking at companies in the global south and saying, we have factory sites in relatively rural areas. And that's true now for Western corporations as well. How do we think about low-cost energy and water solutions? If you're in rural India and you have a manufacturing facility there that employs several thousand people, but the region is relatively poor and undeveloped, what are the low-cost solutions that can go for the workforce there? The third area that companies have committed to for a long time is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These are 17 goals set by the United Nations around health, education, partnership, climate change in a lot of different areas, agriculture, and companies and governments have committed to achieve these goals. But here's the main problem, and this ties into the other areas as well. Right now, the United Nations believes that we need $7 trillion a year to complete and support and fund the programming required to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are things like ending poverty for all, providing quality healthcare, providing access to education, as I've listed right here on the right. And so there's a lot of major indicators that people are striving for. Of that 7 trillion that's required, only 2 trillion is being provided by governments and the private sector. And some of that is going towards crises. So, when you have a major climate event like a hurricane or a drought or a heat wave, when you have a COVID pandemic, some of that money that's been allocated for broader sustainable development goals obviously gets allocated towards urgent needs. And so it's not even really 2 trillion that's being spent on the SDGs. It's even less. And yet companies and governments find themselves having made this commitment. And so what they're starting to look at is to say, if we can't increase the amount of money that we're spending to meet these commitments in climate change or diversity or sustainable development goals, how do we identify innovations that bring the cost down significantly? And so that's what we're starting to see there. Of the 1,000 or so startups that our organization interviewed last year, nearly 75% of them were directly working on the SDGs. So there's a lot of startups and innovators and entrepreneurs out there thinking about the sustainable development goals and addressing global health or education or climate in that way. The last one I'll mention that's come up more recently, as the world has emphasized a little bit more of manufacturing and localized manufacturing in the last few years, is the idea of a talented workforce. And how do you build up the skills of your workforce, both for low-skilled work as well as for advanced manufacturing and high-skilled work? How do we create a workforce that addresses major manufacturing and infrastructure projects? In some parts of the world, they're very good at that. In the United States, there's been some data that, some of the infrastructure funded right now in the United States, for example, the new tunnel being built under the Hudson River in New York will need probably 30 to 50,000 trade-skilled professionals in areas like welding and electricians and other areas. How does the United States find them? Real investment in digital skills training, investment in job matching across geographies. Maybe we use tools so that welders sitting in Washington, D.C. can come up to New York, work on the work and come back. How do we think about that differently? How do we think about training differently and certification so that we can get more people working right when we do, and that perhaps through the use of technology, we don't need to send everybody to an additional 2 years of school. We can find other ways to train them, use innovation to get that workforce to work. So these are the challenges outside of new products and sales that major corporations and companies are thinking about, and they're looking at startups and innovation as a way to address that. So what we've seen in the corporate sector is a lot of change in the thinking about how to leverage entrepreneurship for impact. And so companies are really thinking about what would they do in product development. They use processes like Agile and Lean, Six Sigma, and they're saying, how do we bring that over to the other side of this ledger? How do we think about things that were not part of the traditional product development supply chain, like use the product development process and cycle, but also use that for education, use that for skills? How do you integrate better with corporate processes? So it used to be that climate change was this thing on the side that it was nice to do, but it was not necessarily related to the organization's day-to-day activities. But once you commit to net zero, not only do you need to give the philanthropy to support your community, you need to change your supply chain. You need to change how you make your product. So all of a sudden, things like sustainability have become part of the traditional corporate processes. And we see companies using global best practices for this in a way they didn't before. Again, the idea was historically that the challenges of a factory in Massachusetts, in New York, dealt with different climate, different workforce, all of that. It had nothing to do with factories that were maybe in East Asia. And now we're finding actually there's a lot of best practices to be learned that move things along. There's a lot of technologies that can help with that. So companies are using global practices in how they train their workforce and use sites like Coursera and others to create targeted programs across geographies, across product cycles, that sort of thing. And then we're seeing this idea of how do you learn to innovate? And so a corporate accelerator program might have been about new product development. People are saying now, okay, how do we use innovation to also think about better ways to improve other things we do, from training our workforce to climate change, to addressing our philanthropy? How do we think about our philanthropy more effectively, given the limited money that we have? And so corporations have shifted their work essentially to say, for these major challenges, we got to integrate with our processes. We can't keep it separate as a separate line item, a separate organization. It has to behave more and more like we're seeing here. The leader in this was really for a long time was the consumer products industry. We saw that with Unilever, Colgate, Palmolive, others who were saying, this is something, we have customers, we have huge teams, we have a global presence. This has to be integrated better. Now we're starting to see that in other old line industries as well. So internally, this has meant 4 steps for companies. It means thinking about how to learn about these new technologies. So if you're a food producing company, how do you learn about plant-based foods? That involves a new technology often called CRISPR, which is about gene editing. It involves big data. It doesn't involve drones, as the slide says, but it involves a lot of things. So how do you as an organization first learn about these opportunities structurally? That can often include M&A, that could include running innovation programs, that can include taking a few years with a consulting firm to hire out. There's a lot of literature and data obviously out there. The second has been to nurture these programs internally. So that's essentially where we see a lot of work, where large organizations will want to identify emerging innovations in a specific space. Again, using the example of plant-based foods as a new product line. They'll want to know what's going on in that space. They'll run their own accelerator. They'll see how these products integrate with their own work and what the factories may need to do differently if they're producing a plant-based food. Same with climate change, the scrubbers, the carbon capture technologies being developed. Large companies are running accelerators to see how these fit into their existing systems and what needs to change. And when they're able to do that, once they figure out which are the right technologies for them, then they're doing the traditional steps of organizing, getting their entire change management done within the organization to integrate new technologies. And then, of course, working with regulators, which is what we're seeing in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act, which gave a lot of incentives for companies and for people to switch to electric solar or heat pumps or other tools. And so it's sort of the natural progression we're seeing in climate, in diversity, and other areas where companies are saying, we need to figure out what's there and then utilize that for our purposes. Just a little bit about us. What we found and what we often advise our clients about is that there is a global innovation ecosystem that exists. And so when we think of innovation, we often think of Silicon Valley. We might think of Israel. We might think of London, Beijing, Bangalore, a few places. But the reality is that there's well over 4,000 innovation centers and startup accelerators around the world. And there's countless small business initiatives all around the world. So there are high quality products and service providers everywhere in the world that can work with large companies and governments to address some of these challenges. And they work in all these sectors that we're talking about: energy, they're working in life sciences and global health, they're working in education, and they all have customized local solutions. And so it shouldn't be that we all need to go to Silicon Valley to find the next big solution. There are quite a few solutions in our backyard, or perhaps where we have factories or facilities and need local partnerships. And there's a lot of ways to engage with them. There's targeted global conferences where a lot of folks network with each other. There's a lot of research reports that we do, others do, the consulting world does. There's targeted events, roundtables like Gartner Group does, like Equal Innovation does. So there's ways to strategically engage with these innovators. And then there's the need to connect with government, with funders and others who can help you get to this stage where you start to work with these startups and perhaps fund their transition from startup to corporate partner for you. But there is a whole global ecosystem available out there. We ourselves work with 3,500 innovation centers around the world and connect with them. And for our clients, try to connect them to the relevant startup, which may be very broad. It may be looking at what's going on in the supply chain space. It may be very specific to what's going on in Europe that has intellectual property I can acquire that will help me reduce the amount of water I need to use in manufacturing. So it can get very broad or very specific, but there are ecosystems for organizations to tap into to look at all of these things. So a little bit about global trends in innovation and entrepreneurship. And this is all subjective. There's so many things we could talk about here. So I'll just go over a couple of different things. One of the things we're seeing in the agriculture side, particularly in countries like India, is real investment in agriculture technology and water. And that's across the board. That's just not farming production companies like a Mahindra. It's also consumer goods. It's also strategic manufacturing as they look at water and local sourcing. It's global companies like Walmart who are looking at ag tech and saying, okay, how do we increase a lot of India's farmers are just sustainable. They have 1 acre or less. Their subsistence in the income. How do we double their income? How do we make them into reliable production partners? And some of that is teaching better irrigation, providing them with the tools, the vendor financing. Some of it is newer innovations that can increase their yield, drought-resistant seeds as we deal with climate change. So that's something we're seeing a lot of. Similarly, at the G20 last year, which is the global summit of the world's 20 largest economies. It was held in India last year. This year it'll be in Brazil. Equal Innovation was proud to host a side startup event last year, and will intend to this year as well, where we brought together startups that were working on global challenges that were being talked about by world leaders. And so it's one thing for world leaders to make commitments. The second thing is they need to understand which innovations are really relevant to what they're doing. So as we did that, we brought in folks across the board. We had 40 startups from 15 countries. Some of it was in ag tech and climate. Some of it was even in blockchain, looking at that as a tracking software, but a diversity of startups to really think about, what's the impact that startup technology innovation can have on these global issues. There, they were talking about redundant supply chains because of the conflicts in the world. They were talking about climate change. They were talking about pandemic preparedness, and is the world ready and better prepared for the next pandemic, and who's working on that? And the answer was a big shrug of shoulders. And again, that's sort of why it's important that we know who are the researchers working on this and the next set of vaccines. Similarly, there was some work. Google was looking at misinformation, and an example of a startup like that is Matchbook AI, which is really looking at truth, sort of evaluating what's correct data, what's fake data, what's factually accurate. And for a company like Google, continuously finding startups like this is critical to their mission, not just for search, but obviously for the faith that we have in a search engine like Google and the results that it finds. And of course, the UN as a global organization, we worked with them looking at healthcare solutions for the Middle East region, and in particular for the conflict region, the countries in conflict in that region, and what are some of the telemedicine tools that can be provided in conflict situations. And so there is innovation like Cura there that can be deployed. And so the first goal has really been, what is in the innovation ecosystem that will address these global challenges that companies and governments are committed to but struggling to address. Here's a good example of really one of the most amazing startups in the world that's doing just this. Logistimo, they're based out of United States and India, and they have been a partner with the UN, different UN agencies and the Gates Foundation and private investors for several years now. And in recent years, they have tracked 65 million vaccine dosages as they've traveled in the developing world. And it's so important. They're a big partner with big pharma companies as well, who have obviously developed the vaccines, but may not know how to move in countries like a Zambia or a Malawi or Sudan, where there's some challenging situations. And so Big Pharma has committed to donate vaccine dosages. That's part of their strategic mission. That's part of their objective. But they need to be able to get them there. Groups like the United Nations provide the trucks, the local partnerships, but then a company like Logistimo can come in and provide the tracking and the software and help these organizations to move along. So this is an example, a very specific example as well of a startup. And now they grew over time with funding and partnerships. But now they've, during the COVID years, they were a platform that many different pharma use to track their vaccines and their dosages. And for those of you who don't know the pharma space, pharmaceutical companies often will sell their vaccines, but they will often donate millions as well, which during COVID was something that we saw quite a bit of. But even otherwise, we see this with essential vaccines required for young children around the world. And Logistimo is the type of startup partner that you need to get into these difficult countries. Excuse me. We're seeing a lot of innovation in the world also in areas like materials. So here we have a material called graphene, which has been around for quite a bit of time. And it's changing the way we do a couple of different things. My favorite is around water desalination, where water is obviously, fresh water is about 7% of the world's water supply. With the increasing heat waves and other things going on around the world, it's something in greater need. Excuse me. And so materials like graphene are being used for water desalination, for irrigation, for pipelines, as both a more environmentally efficient material, but also something that's just more effective. As you can see, it's thinner, it conducts electricity, Materials pass through more easily. So there's a lot of uses for a material like graphene. This was originally developed for oil pipelines. And what's important is now we're starting to see the applications of these technologies in other areas that where we have global challenges. And so water desalination, local rural irrigation, using graphene in those is already cheaper now because the development costs have already gone in by the oil companies to develop this for the work that they're doing. So climate change and electrification, everybody around the world knows about this. We're seeing major EV options come out from car companies around the world. In this slide, I talk a little bit about automotive, but we're seeing actually electrification as a much, much broader trend as part of companies' trends towards fighting climate change, but also using renewable energy, which is going to be cheaper in the future than anything else. So not only are we seeing investments in the solar panels, we're seeing an offshore wind, even new emerging technologies like DNA storage, which is the idea that we can learn from biology how to use less energy in the storage of our energy and information. So electrification overall is a big, big trend. And of course, we're starting to see that governments are giving major incentives for the automotive industry, transportation, for agriculture, for manufacturing to electrify. Again, not just to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, but also because we believe there will be in the next generation enough alternative energy sources that are clean so that we can have the power we need to run the economy as we see fit. But all of this requires a transition, it requires startups. One of the things we're seeing a lot here is small business categories in areas like this. And so obviously with solar panels, we've seen a lot of small companies start up that are working on solar panel installation. Similar with EV charging stations, there's significant funding and incentives around starting an EV charging station, which the hope is amongst governments in the world that this becomes a small business franchise opportunity, similar to opening a McDonald's or something else, where people can own franchises of EV charging stations, provide that service, much like they do ATMs and food and other areas. I want to switch over a little bit to two areas we're seeing in education a little bit. And with the release of Apple's new AR VR headset a few weeks ago, I wanted to come back to this. Excuse me, I'm just fighting a cold here. What we're seeing that with Apple releasing the new AR VR headset, there's going to be a renewed interest in the role of virtual reality and augmented reality, particularly in areas like healthcare and education. During the pandemic in 2020, nearly all the school children in India were home for nearly 2 years. And worldwide, we saw significant learning loss because of students being kept out of school. So the question is going to be asked, what will we do next time, unfortunately, if there's a next time, to ensure that that is not repeated? They may have to leave school, but that doesn't mean they don't have to learn. So in certain countries, we're seeing significant investment in wireless infrastructure, in broadband access to internet, all of these sorts of things. But we're also seeing more use of technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality so that a student sitting at home can virtually access a virtual classroom, content, perhaps visualize the real world experiences that they might have had otherwise. Similarly, in healthcare, training and disaster response, there's a lot we can do to train medical professionals in the global south using virtual reality and augmented reality, because those are tools that are, again, they can access from where they are. The content can be developed in the West or elsewhere. And this is just not a West to global South issue. This is also an issue of large cities in the developing world and more rural areas in the developing world, and a lack of care. So it's not just about sort of the West versus others. It's really looking at resource situations with resources and those without. So we're seeing companies like Microsoft, Apple, others really getting to the space. We're seeing large hospital systems and healthcare IT companies getting into the space because this appears to be the future of where we're going. And lastly, one I see as a fun area to talk about. So arts and culture has always been a staple of traditional philanthropy by companies around the world. And this is part of our building our societies, making us unique on this planet, our arts and culture. And there also we're seeing a lot of interesting innovation there. I really like this color matching pen. It's something children are using. It allows them to digitally scan their art, allows them to continue to draw in the traditional way while traditionally scanning. Again, huge applications, as you can imagine, in education, in the arts, in other areas. And this is something where innovation in traditional philanthropy and government support has been where there's opportunity. So it's not just about climate change and the bottom line. It's not just about DEI and the workforce. It's also about the arts and what kind of society we live in. So a couple of takeaways. This is the framework that we use and we share with our clients and people who are interested about how to be thinking about developing innovations and identifying innovations. The first thing that companies and large organizations really need to do is assess their priorities and their areas. I mentioned earlier, some clients come to us and just want to work on climate change. Well, that's great, but that's so many different things to so many people. It's really important to be able to figure out, what is the major commitment that my company has made, and in what sector do I need help with? It might be actually access to voting. That might be a major focus of your company to say we should have an educated workforce who's out there active in their community. That narrows it down. Then what are we looking for to improve that item? If it's supply chain and reducing the amount of water you use, okay, great. That's hard water. Is it soft water? Are we talking about the West? Are we talking about a developing country? What is it? So that assessment of priorities is really critical. And then, what for us, we believe that global network really is an important source of that. So we really go out there and look at the different innovation centers around the world and say, okay, who's working on that specific topic? If you're interested in biodiversity, there's a great number of universities in Brazil, obviously, that are thinking about this because of the situation in the Amazon. If you're thinking about supply chain, there's a great number of companies in Europe, startups that are working out of the Netherlands and other places that have been thinking about this for a long time, not just recently, and there's an ecosystem there. So we really look at who are the key partners in that, and we reach out across these 3,500 accelerators as well, and to see who else is working that. Because again, you might have a factory in Malaysia and you want a solution that's sourced from somewhere around there. You shouldn't have to be flying to Silicon Valley to find those solutions. Then we work hand in hand with the company or the government agency to really, of the short list we've come up with, who's relevant, who's really got the solutions that are there. And then we work with them to integrate that solution into the work they're doing. Some of our favorite companies over the last few years, there's one called Stimulus, which has developed a platform for diverse founders that are suppliers to big companies to list their products and services. And they provide a matchmaking service to help companies that are looking for a more diverse supplier base. So that's an example of a startup that came through this network where we worked with a company to say, okay, what do you want to do? They said, we want to diversify our supplier base. We went out there, found several companies. They really like Stimulus. And so here we are, and Stimulus is working with them. We've done this across the board in different sectors, blockchain, climate, whatever it might be. And what's interesting is we actually don't see a lot of this even for tech, right? So you might say to yourself, in an area like artificial intelligence, this must be common. And in fact, it's not. And what we're seeing is a lot of, who's got the hype, what's going on in Silicon Valley. We're not seeing organizations take a more substantial long-term view about the technologies that are relevant to them and then building from there. So there's really a need to do this much more broadly and not just about areas where major commitments have been made. Lastly, there's global forums where we see a lot of this sort of startup innovation going on that's relevant to big companies and big issues. So I mentioned last year we hosted an event in India at the G20, 40 startups from across 12 countries, blockchain, supply chain, AI, cybersecurity, a lot of topics there that are of interest to large organizations and relevant to their impact and the commitments they've made. Clinton Global Initiative, same thing, global forums at the UN General Assembly talking about these big commitments. Hulk Prize is the largest social entrepreneurship prize in the world. Their winner last year, Banafee Leather, has come up with a plant-based leather. They've gotten interest from the entire luxury goods industry about the work that they're doing. So again, doing well by doing good, talking to some of the most expensive leather producing consumer goods companies in the world with the solution that they have, which is part of their product line, hopefully another sort of funding opportunity as well. And lastly, I'll just say that I think, I talked a lot about corporations and that sort of thing here, but I think we see this across the board. We see opportunities for startups to have a broader presence. We see hospital systems that are expanding and want to work with partners in the developing world to improve health outcomes. We see universities, we see companies. There's a whole new category of impact investors that are looking at technologies, along with venture capital and private equity. So many people around the world looking at where is the solution to the problem I have. And our view is that it's out there in the innovation ecosystem. Somebody's working on it. And if we want to really address these big global challenges, we have to be thinking about that as well. So I'll stop there. It's about the time that was given to me, and happy to answer questions that might be there.
All right, thank you for the presentation. Yes, we're open for questions right now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type in your questions here in the chat box or in the Q&A box so that our speaker can answer the questions for you. Now, while we are waiting, I just want to make some announcement. For those who are not yet a member of International Trade Council, we can give you free membership for attending this educational session. So please feel free to reach out to me directly and I can help you out. Also, this webinar is recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if you would like to replay, please feel free to do so. Lastly, you will receive a certificate of participation in the next days. Proof that you attended this webinar. So just wait for the email that will be sent by my colleague. So again, we're open for questions now. If you have any questions, okay, there you go.
So the question is, what is the primary goal and focus of Equal Innovation? How does it contribute to advancing innovative practices? So I had the pleasure of working for President Obama about 10 years ago as his Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And the two challenges I saw in the entrepreneurship space were, one, that there's been a global growth in entrepreneurship. So it's not, as I was saying, just in Silicon Valley, Bangalore, Beijing, but there's high quality startups and innovations around the world. And yet the capital is still isolated in those 6 or 7 cities of the world that are considered the tech hubs. And so that was one issue, is how do we do a better job scouting and identifying high quality innovations from around the world? The second trend I was seeing was this growth of impact-oriented innovation. So a lot more startups and innovators thinking about global health or about climate change or about education than before. And these are not traditionally VC-backed sectors. And so the question was, we have global startups and we have impact-oriented startups, and none of them fall in the traditional VC demo day fabric. And so how do we do a better job identifying them and serving it and creating a clearinghouse where they can connect to the right partners and at least get a chance to prove their technology? And so that's been our work. So most of our work is with foundations, large corporations, government agencies, to help them identify the innovations that they're looking for, short-term and long-term. So short-term, it might be, what's out there that we can integrate off the shelf and hire. It might be more of a challenge to say, look, over a 5 to 10 year period, we need to innovate in this space. We don't see a lot of this innovation. What can you help us find? And let's do some prizes, some challenges, some R&D, that sort of thing. So that's been our main focus. Our main areas of focus have been climate, global health, education, migration, and humanitarian response. and then AI as it relates to those areas of education and health and those sorts of things.
Thank you. Next
Go ahead,
question.
Ron.
Yes, there you go. There's another question
Okay.
here.
So for anybody interested in working with us, my email is here on the slide. It's moreinfo@equalinnovation.com, and I'd be thrilled to have a conversation with any and all of you about the work we're doing and see if there's opportunity for collaboration.
Perfect. Thank you. So we have another question here.
Mm-hmm. How do you engage with startups, and how do you charge for the services? Are there benefits for
Oh, no,
ITC
no.
members?
There's a question before that. It's projected on the screen right now.
Oh, I see.
Please guide how my company,
Right.
CGCS Global, can collaborate for equal innovation as my company related to innovative PR company.
So I think so. In general, I think we can have a conversation about how to partner on the scouting. I think on the PR side, what's interesting is um, a lot of what we do need is to make people aware that there are innovative solutions around the world. And so, I use the example of a startup in Malaysia being more relevant to companies in Asia than a startup in Silicon Valley doing the same thing. And so, a lot of that challenge that we're trying to solve is in fact a communications one. How do we make that available? How do we share that to the right people? And so I'd love to chat about collaboration in terms of making people aware of solutions that are out there that they can use as well in terms of PR, social media, social networks, all of that sort of thing.
Thank you. And next question here. How do you engage with startups and how do you charge for the services? Are
Mhm.
there any benefits for IDC members to work with Equal Innovation?
So we would love to create a special program with ITC members for sure, and perhaps something that we can send out as a follow up to everybody. I'll coordinate with Ron on that
Sure.
to do some sort of membership benefit. In terms of our model, we do not charge these startups at all because they just don't have the money to focus on these things. They are often focused on developing their products, hiring their team, and just getting going. And so our focus is to partner with the companies and the foundations. They usually pay for the scouting and the connection, as well as often flying startups in to their headquarters to sort of identify the collaboration period, or have them participate in their accelerators. So our model is one where we work with the 3,500 innovation centers and entrepreneurship programs around the world. We ask them for their nominations of startups. So in the example I gave of Stimulus, which was the supplier vendor startup, that was nominated to us by the University of Pennsylvania in the city of Philadelphia. We then reached out to Stimulus, learned more about them, and plugged them into an opportunity that we thought was relevant for their work. So we rely very much on our global network of partners in the innovation community, and then we do not charge them or their startups for the work. Instead, our funding comes from the other side, from the corporations and others who are looking for this funding.
All right. Next question here is: have you had any collaboration requests in Nigeria?
We actually have, I think it's about 5 or 6 startup accelerators from Nigeria that are in our network. We actually get good feedback from them every year. There's quite a bit of startup activity in Nigeria. Unfortunately, we haven't had a lot of work with larger Nigerian companies or the Nigerian government, but it's becoming the largest, alongside South Africa, the largest startup ecosystem in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. And so we imagine there'll be a lot more to do over the next few years in that space, particularly in the area of impact sourcing, where a lot of tech back office services are being offered by startups in Nigeria as a service to Western companies.
Thank you. We have one more here. According to you, are the unfair advantages for startup to be unique among its ecosystem?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So Sean, can you please rephrase or clarify the question so Nish can answer the question for you?
Well, so I think the one of the things I'll say for startups is there is an unfair advantage to being in the tech hubs of the world in that capital is much more prevalent. So in the United States, for example, which is the world's largest entrepreneurship um, startup country, 75% of the venture capital is located in the state of California or in the northeast part of the United States, which includes Boston, New York, Philadelphia. So there's an unfair advantage to being in that ecosystem physically. The same in India. The bulk of the venture capital is in Bangalore. In China, it's Beijing and Shanghai. So that's an unfair advantage based on geography that we're trying to help areas overcome. In terms of the startups, the only advantage startups have is if they have intellectual property and patents. Most of the success or failure of startup comes from finding the right product market fit and the speed with which they work to get ahead. So it really is about the team, how hard they work, and how quickly they can get ahead, and less so about the product for most startups. Where there's intellectual property in areas like medical sciences, agriculture, energy, that's the unfair advantage they often have because globally we recognize patents as being the most important factor in terms of funding startups. So I'm not sure if I answered your question correctly, but that's, I think, maybe some of what you're asking.
All right, thank you. And you just do a follow up in terms or in the field of tourism and hospitality.
Right. So we actually haven't seen a lot in tourism and hospitality in terms of startup activity. We've seen it in media, which is sort of in consumer space, which is parallel. And what I'll say there is in this space, the unfair advantage is those that are able to quickly partner with the global sites. And so most of the apps that we're seeing in the tourism and hospitality space, their quick path to growth is to partner with some of the larger global tourism sites. We're not seeing a lot of hotel chains and others partner with startups. They tend to be more sticking close to their business and their hotels and service, things like that. So in the tech side, we're seeing the need for startups to partner with the Trip Advisors of the world and other Make My Trip and similar sites like that. There has been a lot of growth in the ecotourism space. And so I think that's an interesting space where there's a lot of opportunity to develop ecotourism really around the world. And that's been, I think, underdeveloped and undersold by governments. And so what I mean by that is if you go on a traditional tourist site, there are often ecotourism opportunities. And there's quite a few startups supporting, helping you find those ecotourism opportunities. And so there connections from the startup space of people trying to match up people looking to have a smaller footprint with people looking to provide those services when they get to their vacation destination. But we're not seeing a lot of government support for that at this time in the way that we hope to. That may be something as part of climate change that more sustainable tourism gets more interest, but we haven't seen it yet.
All right, thank you. Any more questions? All right, so I don't see any other questions here. 1 second. All right, it seems that all the question has been answered. Okay. All right, so I don't see any other questions. Before we conclude the educational session, Nish, would you like to have your final statement or anything you would like to add before we end?
I just want to thank everybody for attending and listening. I hope it was useful, and I will certainly follow up with Ron about creating something we can do with ITC members, and look forward to hearing from any and all of you at more info at equalinnovation.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And before we end, just want to answer Karsten's question. Yes, we have some business counsel. Please feel free to email me, and I can definitely discuss further. So again, thank you so much for attending today's educational session. Thank you, Nish, for having this presentation, and we look forward having an educational session again with you in the future. And to everyone in the audience, thank you for your time today, and we look forward seeing you in the next webinar. Thank you for your time, and you all have a wonderful day.